The resuming debate, the honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Madam Speaker, now I've been around this place long enough to see a clear pattern of what a Liberal budget is, and also their omnibus budget implementation acts, which of course they promised not to use. So what exactly is the pattern of a Liberal budget, you ask? We have to go back to 2015 for a moment. Well, what happened in 2015, this Prime Minister promised 3 years of so-called modest deficit spending budgets before he made a cast-in-stone promise to return to a balanced budget in 2019. What happened to that promise, you may ask? Well, in every one of those 3 years, the Prime Minister spent considerably more than he promised he would. And in 2019, he didn't even attempt to honor his so-called cast-in-stone promise to return Canada to a balanced budget. In other words, this Liberal Prime Minister did not even try to do what he promised he would. So why even make the promise at all to return to a balanced budget when you have zero intention of doing so? Because, of course, making promises on things he has no intention of ever honoring is basically a hallmark character trait of this Prime Minister. So where are we today with this latest Liberal 2024 budget? We are now at total spending of $535 billion for the 2024-2025 fiscal year. Let's pause for a moment to recap. The 2022 so-called return to fiscal responsibility budget was $434 billion. Now, here we are in the 2024 budget, and the proposed spending is up to $535 billion. This means that this latest Liberal budget proposes to spend $100 billion more than what the Liberals themselves labeled as a return to fiscal responsibility budget just a short time ago. And let us not forget that before the pandemic began in 2019-2020, the Liberals were spending around $338 billion. So we went from $338 billion to now $535 billion. That is an increase of almost $200 billion a year in annual spending. Let's not kid ourselves. Everyone knows the Liberals will spend more than the $535 billion they are proposing. More so given that next year is an election year. So now we can all see the pattern to Liberal budgets that I mentioned earlier. Every year we're told what will happen, but never actually comes to pass. The forecasts, the promises, everything the Liberals promise ends up being completely false. They do not even try to live within the fiscal limits they propose for themselves. And most offensive of all is the Prime Minister's office has the audacity to label this budget as the Fairness for Every Generation budget. I'm literally aghast, Madam Speaker, by this. The 2024 Fairness for Every Generation budget proposes a $40 billion deficit for this fiscal year alone. We know that this is not the case. The Finance Department has put out saying that there are billions over that particular projection already. This is noteworthy because the Liberals for previous debt forecasts were at $35 billion for 2024-2025 and $26.8 billion for 2025-2026. So, Madam Speaker, that's a big difference we can see. $40 billion, and now, previously they said $27 or so billion for 2025. We all know the cost of servicing this national debt has exceeded the federal spending on health care. This, Madam Speaker, is what Liberals call fairness for everyone. Not unlike the capital gains increase, the Liberals will tell you this tax only impacts Canada's most wealthy. Yet we heard from many everyday Canadians who, through a divorce, a health crisis, retirement or otherwise, are in a one-time situation where they might be looking at paying a once-in-a-lifetime capital gains tax. Doctors, small business owners, people in the trades, you name it. Larry the plumber was brought up today by our member from Winnipeg who's working hard. None of these people are so-called ultra-wealthy, but they will all be hit hard by this latest Liberal tax grab. The Liberals know that these people exist and also know that the Liberal tax grab will hit them hard. But they still will look you in the eye and say only the ultra-wealthy are impacted by this. I don't know if anyone, the Liberal or NDP side of the House, realize how angry people become when they believe they are deceived and misled by their own government. But make no mistake, they are not happy with this Prime Minister. And he needs that extra tax grab for fairness, he says. Let's talk about fairness, Madam Speaker, for a moment. There is now an entire generation of young Canadians who are left out despite all of the Liberal spending. Literally, this problem is so bad that even the Prime Minister himself now openly admits that young people now feel like they can't get ahead in the same way their parents or grandparents could. But it's much worse than that. This Prime Minister is leaving future generations of Canadians with record levels of debt with no plan whatsoever to return to a balanced budget ever. This Prime Minister has failed in every single budget to do what he promised he would do in the budget the year previously. He just spends more and we go further into debt. That's not fairness. Now, before I close, Madam Speaker, I'd like to share something with this place. We, of course, spend a portion of our time in this place debating budgets and budget implementation acts. For a sitting government, they hope to table a budget that resonates with Canadians. As all experienced parliamentarians will know, some budgets resonate more than others, some very little at all. This particular budget has not been like most. I do not recall at any time so many different citizens coming forward in opposition to a budget as they are for this budget, and by extension, this Budget Implementation Act. I make a point of reading every email and returning every phone call and scheduling as many meeting requests as I can. I can tell every member of this place that this particular budget is not impacting many Canadians the way the Liberal government would have you believe. The Liberals may call this a fairness for every generation budget, but many I hear from see this budget as being anything but fair to them. I'm not one to follow polls, so it doesn't surprise me at all that so many different polls show this budget, like this Liberal government, as falling down so badly. Madam Speaker, I would submit this is without doubt an unfair budget for many Canadians. I will be joining with those Canadians who now say enough is enough in rejecting this Prime Minister and his desperation budgets and this flawed Budget Implementation Act. One final point before I conclude my comments this evening. Earlier today, I read a report from the National Post, and the headline said it all. Airplane food cost more than $220,000 on the Prime Minister's Indo-Pacific trip. Meals included beef brisket with mashed parsley potatoes with truffle oil, braised lamb shanks, and baked cheesecake with pistachio brittle. When the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister lecture others about fairness and needing people to do a little more, why is it that this Prime Minister never does his part? That the reason, Madam Speaker, is this Prime Minister is always above these rules. Why does this Prime Minister consistently make demands upon others that he himself fails to follow? Canadians, Madam Speaker, are tired of this. And in my riding, for sure, I'm sure with many other members in this place, they want an election, and they do not want this budget or this Budget Implementation Act, and that is why I will be opposing it. I'd like to thank all members of this place for taking the time to hear my comments today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, very quickly, Madam Speaker, you know, Member made reference to aircraft and expenses. I was in opposition when Stephen Harper actually flew to India and then made the decision to fly his car to India at a cost of $1 million for the taxpayer. Now, you know, at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, we value all tax dollars. We also value the services that tax dollars can provide. There's the difference between Conservatives and Liberals. Liberals care, Conservative reformers, they cut. My question to the member is related to the cuts. We talk about disability benefits, we talk about pharmacare, we can talk about dental care. These are the type of programs that this government is getting behind, providing literally hundreds, if not thousands, of his constituents supports. Why is the Reform Party of Canada, or the Conservative Party, same thing, made the determination that they're going to cut those services?
The Honourable Member Central, Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Madam Speaker, I'll let Canadians judge the content and the conduct of that member. He can't even get the party's rights, the correct names in this room, so I don't know if they'll trust him with details. When it comes to a Prime Minister's security detail, Madam Speaker, it is the RCMP that make the decision on what security is appropriate. I believe that it's important for a Prime Minister to remain safe and secure, particularly when we're doing international travel. So I'll leave the RCMP to make those concerns. But, Madam Speaker, what is 100% under the conduct of the Prime Minister is his perchant for expensive hotels, for the $220,000 on meals and alcohol, Madam Speaker. That is what I'm contesting here, Madam Speaker, not the security detail.
L'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague started his speech. We cannot hear the question from the Honourable Member because there are people that are having a debate. That is not the one we should be listening to at the moment, so I hope that people will adhere to the decorum of this chamber and not speak while someone else who has been recognised is speaking. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague mentioned the importance of striking a budgetary balance and cutting useless government costs. In C69, there is a subsidy for oil and gas, for apparently green hydrogen, a tax credit that can go from 15 to 40%. Just last year, when we see what the federal deficit was, it was about $40 billion. How much tax credit was given to oil and gas? $30 billion. We could cut 75% of the deficit just like that, Madam Speaker. Isn't that just a great idea that my colleague could think about?
For Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Speaker, it is important to note that the Bloc Québécois wants to vote for or against the government and their bill. It's the member's prerogative. Who has the prerogative to decide if a budget, if the Prime Minister is good and balanced for Canadians? With regard to the Conservative Party, it's important to note we vote against the government. We have no trust whatsoever in this Prime Minister and no trust whatsoever in the Minister for Finance. And the bill here before us will never be approved by myself or my party. I'd like to commend the Honourable Member for his French. Questions and comments?
Honorable député de New Westminster, Burnett.
I like my colleague, but he said, well, I've never seen a budget with such a negative response. I remember a budget, and he would too. The terrible, horrible, no good, very bad Harper budget of 2012 that gutted veteran services, gutted health care, forced seniors to work years longer in their lives, and gave billions, tens of billions of dollars in handouts to banks and billionaires and oil and gas CEOs. Conservative financial management is an oxymoron, Madam Speaker. So I like my colleague a lot, but how could he possibly not apologize for that extraordinarily bad budget and the terrible financial management of the Harper years?
Brief answer, the Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Madam Speaker, I'm so happy that this member from the NDP has raised the subject of choices and what is worthy of support. I actually spoke to a constituent that could not believe that the NDP supported the Budget Implementation Act last year because they made big changes to natural health products and their regulations, and they could not understand why the NDP would support the Minister of Health to put in place a regime which is actually going to see less types of consumer choice and more expensive natural health products. Madam Speaker, I would love for this member to start acting like and looking through the Budget Implementation Act like he probably did with Mr. Harper, but I would like to also see the NDP start standing up to this Prime Minister and their terrible bills.